From A&E, this is Biography.
Their remarkable story inspired one of America's best-loved musicals. The Von Trapp family lost a fortune, fled from Hitler, and then started a new life in the hills of Vermont. Each year, more than 100,000 tourists visit those hills to see the lodge immortalized in the sound of music. But while the movie version remains a classic, the Von Trapps were hardly the perfect family portrayed by Hollywood, and Maria Von Trapp was far different from the Julie Andrews version. Right now, The Sound of Music is back on Broadway. The Von Trapps are in their Vermont lodge, welcoming visitors eager to meet the real family behind the Rodgers and Hammerstein fantasy.
The hills are alive with the sound of music. With songs.
The Sound of Music is one of the most beloved musical films of all time. It is the story of the Von Trapp family, a sweet governess, a stern father, and 7 motherless children. But the Von Trapps were not just a Hollywood creation. They were a real family of professional singers, and they couldn't have been more different than their on-screen counterparts. The real Maria wasn't sweet, the captain wasn't stern, and the 10 children worked so hard they had little time for anything else. The real Von Trapps survived loss, hardship, and family upheaval, drama left untold in The Sound of Music. The real Georg von Trapp was indeed a Navy captain. Born into the Austrian aristocracy, he joined the Navy as a young man and quickly rose through the ranks to become a submarine captain. In 1914, World War engulfed Europe, and Georg von Trapp was sent to clear the Austrian seacoast of enemy ships. He was quite successful, and by the end of the war, Georg was awarded highest military honors and the title of Baron. He was a national hero. But a naval hero had no place in the new Austria. By November of 1918, Austria was defeated. The captain returned home to a country that had been forced to surrender its coastline and its navy.
So there was no navy. And people like Georg von Trapp lost their livelihood. They lost their way of looking at things. It meant the loss of a culture. It meant the complete breakdown of what they had stood for, fought for, lived for.
With the Navy gone, Georg lost all ambition. Only 38 years old, he would never work again. Fortunately, Georg didn't need to work. His wife Agatha came from an enormously wealthy family and had inherited a huge fortune. So Georg returned home to their seaside villa to live the quiet life of an aristocrat with his wife and their 7 children. But the quiet was not to last. Both his wife Agatha and middle daughter Maria, nicknamed Mitzi, were struck with scarlet fever. Mitzi recovered, Agatha did not. 31-year-old Agatha Whitehead von Trapp died September 3rd, 1922. She left behind 7 small children. The youngest was not yet 1. Trying to put the past behind them, Georg moved his family away from the sea to a new home in Salzburg, but nothing seemed to help.
It was awful, of course, for us, I think for a child, the pain is very deep. Of course, we missed her terribly.
The family limped along for 4 years, until one day, a young woman arrived at their house and changed everything. Her name was Maria Augusta Kuchera, the new governess for the Von Trapp children. She had been sent from the local convent, Nonberg Abbey. But for Maria Kuchera, it was a reluctant assignment. All of 21 years old, Maria had dreamed of becoming a nun and living her life within the walls of Nonberg. Nonberg Abbey had given Maria the first loving home she'd ever had. She never really knew her own parents. Before she turned 3, her mother was dead of pneumonia, and her father had deserted her. Maria was left in the care of an elderly uncle who beat her constantly, whether she behaved or not. And young Maria never behaved. She played hooky, lied compulsively, and when she did go to school, she was always in trouble. As a teenager, Maria did attend church regularly, but only to hear the free music. She was not a practicing Catholic. But on one occasion, a priest convinced her to give her first confession, and it changed her life. Maria spent hours in the confessional, and when the priest finally pronounced all of her sins absolved, Maria experienced such relief, she decided to dedicate her life to God by becoming a nun. She headed straight to Nonberg Abbey.
She did everything not to 100%, but 110%. So having found a religious belief in her late teens, she immediately wanted to devote her life to God and wanted to enter the strictest convent available.
Before Nonberg would accept her as a nun in training, Maria had to prove herself worthy. She tried to live a life of silence and subjugation, but she could not seem to control herself. She ran everywhere, whistled, and made others laugh. It soon became clear that the irrepressible Maria was ill-suited for the life of a nun, and she would never get the chance. One morning, the Reverend Mother called for her. A wealthy widower was looking for a governess, and the Reverend Mother had chosen Maria. It was the will of God, Maria was told, for her to leave the abbey to work at the Von Trapp home. Maria was crushed. She had come to love her life at Nonberg, but there was nothing she could do. So, on a late summer day in 1926, Maria took a bus to the other side of Salzburg and entered a world of wealth and luxury unlike anything she had ever known.
When she came into the house, we didn't know what to do with her. She had a horrible dress on, But very soon we took to her because she sang lots of songs.
In fact, Maria was just what the gloomy Von Trapp family needed. She took the children on mountain hikes and long bike rides through town. And she got all 7 children to sing together as a group.
And so we enjoyed singing together. And wherever we went, we had to go with everybody because we wanted to sing. We needed tenor, alto, tenor, and bass, So we always went together. And it sort of melted us together too,
The children and Maria seemed to be made for each other. Even Georg seemed a happier man with Maria in the house. Then, one afternoon, Georg took Maria by complete surprise. Out of the blue, he asked her to become the second mother to his children. Without responding, Maria immediately returned to Nonberg to ask the Reverend Mother for advice. The Reverend Mother told her it was indeed the will of God that she marry the captain. And Maria had been trained at Nonberg always to follow the will of God, even if it meant a loveless marriage. On November 26, 1927, Georg and Maria were married. The captain was 47 and the new Baroness 22. I didn't love him, I loved the children, Maria wrote later. And so, in a way, I really married the children. But the children were not so happy with the new arrangement.
I didn't want my father to marry her, although I liked her, as a bigger sister to stay with us, But I loved my mother so much that I didn't want him to marry again, ever.
In the beginning, Maria tried to take on the quiet persona of the Baron's first wife, but quiet was not for her. When she got angry, she stood at the top of the steps and yelled, threw anything within reach, and slammed doors.
Sometimes she did not know why she was so angry, you know. But then, like a thunderstorm goes away and the sun comes out, and then, you try to forget.
She reserved most of her anger for her husband, but Georg would only respond quietly and then take weeks to recover from her attacks. But for better or for worse, Maria was part of the family. And before long, Maria became a mother in her own right, adding 3 children to the family. Rosemary, Eleanor, and then a boy named Johannes. And as time went by, Maria admitted that she had grown to love her husband and to rely on his calming influence. The Von Trapps lived a comfortable routine, but in an instant, everything would change. In September 1932, the bank with all of the family savings had failed, and their wealth was gone forever. The Von Trapps once had more money than they could ever spend, and now they faced ruin. Baron Von Trapp had once had it all, and now it seemed that everything was falling away. By 1932, his wealth, his beloved first wife, and his Navy career were gone. Now Georg could barely support his family, but still he refused to work.
Work, for these people, it's full of contempt. It's work is for the underlings.
But something had to be done. So Georg tried to cut costs, dismissing most of the servants and closing 2 floors of the house to make it easier to maintain. Soon the entire family of 11 was crammed into a few rooms on the 3rd floor.
So it didn't bother us, but for my father must have been terrible. How am I going to feed and school and dress and whatnot 9 children?
Georg worried, but did little else. So Maria took charge. She began renting the empty rooms to students and priests from the Catholic University. And now, every time the family sang, they had an audience, and a critical one at that. One of the priests always had suggestions on how they could do better. His name was Father Franz Wassner, himself an amateur musician. So, with Maria's approval, Father Wassner became the family's spiritual leader and musical director. Each day, he led the Von Trapps in prayer and then put them through grueling choral singing lessons, sometimes lasting up to 6 hours. And before long, they began to sound like a professional choir. One afternoon, Lottie Lehman, a friend of the family and quite a famous opera singer, heard the Von Trapps in a practice session.
And when she heard us sing, she said, "Children, you have gold in your throat." And I think maybe that gave my second mother the idea we could earn money, by singing,
Maria saw a golden opportunity, and the very next day she entered the family group into a local singing contest. They called themselves the Salzburg Trapp Choir. A family choir was quite a novelty and a hit with the judges. The Von Trapps won first prize and their career was launched. Within months, they received more offers to perform than they knew what to do with. But Georg was appalled by the idea of his family performing for money.
Georg von Trapp being against his family performing is as much his faith in what an aristocrat's family must not do at all. You don't do it for money. Money stinks. You have it, right? But you don't earn it through work.
Yeah, my father didn't really like the idea of performing for money. But I think he got used to the idea. Necessity changes one's point of view in many ways.
The Von Trapps needed the money, so late in 1936, the Salzburg Trapp Choir set off on a European tour. They sang for kings and queens and even the Pope. Audiences could hardly believe that an entire family could sing so well, and their classical and folk repertoire struck a nostalgic chord. Then the Von Trapps received a special request. They were asked to sing at the birthday celebration of one of the most powerful heads of state in Europe, Adolf Hitler. By the time the Von Trapps had received this invitation, Adolf Hitler had already made his political goals clear. He would reunite the German-speaking countries and reassert German preeminence at any cost. And on March 12, 1938, Nazi troops crossed into neighboring Austria, and Hitler summarily announced Anschluss, the union of Austria with Germany. Most Austrians received the Nazis with great enthusiasm, but not the Von Trapps.
My family was strongly opposed to the Nazi Party and the National Socialist movement. My father believed in Austria as a separate country, its own country.
The Von Trapps may not have liked the Nazis, but the Nazis were very interested in the Von Trapps. In fact, they asked Georg to join the German Navy. And Rupert, the eldest son, just out of medical school, was offered a top position in a Vienna hospital to replace a Jewish doctor. They were sorely tempted, particularly Georg, who yearned to be back in charge of a submarine. But in the end, the Von Trapps unanimously decided to decline all offers from the Nazis. And then they went a step further. Rather than remain under Nazi rule, the entire Von Trapp family, along with Father Vossner, chose to leave Austria. They left behind their belongings, their home, everything they knew. But they would not have to climb any mountains to escape. Instead, they walked to their local train station and got on the first train bound for Italy. The Von Trapps would never return to their home. The aristocrats were now refugees. The Von Trapps had left behind all that remained of their wealth when they abandoned their home and country to escape Hitler. Now they carried with them everything they owned, one suitcase each of clothes and their concert gear. The family made their way from Austria through Italy and then on to London. And from there they set out across the Atlantic. The Von Trapps had risked everything, and the cost of their voyage left them nearly penniless. And now their lives hinged on the success of the Trapp family singers. Success that would have to be won in a new and very different country, America. But when at last they arrived in New York, their hopes were quickly dashed.
The immigration officer thought we were planning to stay illegally. And off to Ellis Island we went. And that was quite an experience. To be in a place where the doors have no handles on your side, just bolts.
They waited in detention at Ellis Island for 3 anxious days. Finally, a member of the National Catholic Welfare Conference heard of their plight and saw to it that the Von Trapps were set free. Upon arriving in New York City, Maria hastily arranged a number of concert dates, and the family set off. But they were not well received, and the Trapp family singers barely made enough to scrape by. So Maria decided they needed some help. She wanted a manager who could make the Trapp family choir a success. She set her sights on one of the best, Freddie Shang. But Shang was not at all interested. The Von Trapps, he said, had no charming smile, no good looks, and no commercial appeal. But Maria wouldn't take no for an answer. and finally Shang acquiesced. He agreed to take on the family after Maria agreed to his conditions. Everyone had to wear makeup and relax while on stage. And they had to change the name of the group to something less churchy. The Trapp Family Choir became the Trapp Family Singers. But still, they were hopelessly somber on stage, and they wore clothes that made them look more like refugees than entertainers.
In Europe, concerts are very formal. So my family would stand there very formally and sing, bow, and try to smile, and sing some more.
The family didn't really loosen up until one night a fly flew into Maria's mouth during a performance.
Then she turned to the audience when she had recovered, and she said, "What has happened never before has happened now. I swallowed a fly." And the audience came down. They loved it. She began to realize that they liked communication from the stage.
This would be the turning point for the Trapp Family Singers. They learned to connect with their audiences, and their popularity soared. They became the most heavily booked concert act of their day.
In every concert that I ever saw, there was a real peace that came on the audience. The peace and the joy would increase, particularly with the folk songs.
The Von Trapps toured 8 months a year, traveling in their brand new family bus all across the continent.
Sing we and chant it while of us granted, fa la la la.
Their ancient choral arrangements and folk songs were a hit with highbrow music lovers everywhere.
Audiences were swept away by the concept of a mother and 10 children, all of whom could sing together. And they would drag on little Johannes, who was then about 5 or 6 years old, blonde with bangs, and he would make a very awkward, stiff bow. And then the Baron came out and took a bow for being the father of so many children.
Having 10 children was now the captain's one and only claim to fame. He didn't sing with the group, and though he'd offered his services to the U.S. Navy, they had turned him down. Still, the Baron played an important emotional role with the family. He cared for the younger children, tended to the sick, and seemed to keep the entire family on an even keel.
Well, my mother was the bundle of energy, and in her relationship with my father, I get the feeling that she was the engine, and he was kind of the governor that guided it and controlled it and directed it. I think that they were very well matched in that regard. My mother definitely needed someone to hold her down at times.
Georg was the anchor, but Maria was in charge, and she insisted on togetherness. Year-round, the Von Trapps sang and ate and prayed together. They had little time as individuals, little time to forge outside relationships.
I think my mother discouraged socializing outside the family because she could see that the moment one of my siblings married, there would be children and other responsibilities, and that would take them away from the...
Not only did the Von Trapp children have little contact with the outside world, they just didn't have the money to strike out on their own. Their earnings went straight to the collective family bank account, and they lived ever so frugally. The family that once relied on a bevy of servants now relied only on themselves. By 1942, they had saved enough money to purchase the first real home they'd had since leaving Austria 4 years earlier. They had fallen in love with a piece of land in the mountains above Stowe, Vermont, that reminded them of the view from their Salzburg mansion. But the new home wasn't just a place to relax between tours. Maria insisted they turn their new land into a working farm. Maria came up with the plans, and her children carried them out. They built their own house, milked the cows, produced maple syrup, planted, harvested, hayed. They even started their own summer music camp. and each week taught dozens of people from around the country the Von Trapp style of folk dancing and singing.
She would have an idea a minute. You know, whole projects would jump fully built out into her imagination, and then she couldn't get them done fast enough, which was wonderful for her, but sometimes very strenuous for those that were working with her.
She was a dominant woman. She was dominant in my life. I mean, she'd persuade me to do things which I never thought I would do. She would call me on a Sunday morning and say, "Dear Alex, only you can do this. I need 100 iron bedsteads, or I need 2 dray horses, or I need 18 dozen unbreakable coffee cups with an Edelweiss design." And I would go out and get them.
Maria was so busy directing the family projects, she had little time for anything else. But early in 1945, her publicist, Alex Williamson, suggested that she write a book about the Trapp family singers to help promote the group. Maria protested at first, but then began work in earnest, often writing late into the night. Maria had high expectations for the Trapp family singers when it was published in 1949, and it sold amazingly well. Maria could afford to turn away offers. The Von Trapp family singers were making good money on the concert tour. And they were on a roll until on the West Coast leg of their 1947 tour, Georg took sick, his entire body racked by an uncontrollable cough, which left him so tired he could barely stand. Years of inhaling exhaust fumes on primitive submarines had left his lungs in terrible shape, and they were giving out on him. A chest X-ray revealed lung cancer. It was inoperable.
We were all in the room with him, my father trying to breathe and having a hard time breathing, and then finally there was just a silence.
Georg Ritter von Trapp died May 30th, 1947. He was 67 years old. His family buried him in a plot next to the house, the flag from his U-boat draped across his body. The captain, whose gentle, firm way had held the family together, was gone, and without him, the family would begin to come apart. Georg von Trapp was dead, and Maria found herself consumed with depression and guilt. Throughout the years, Maria's temper had gotten the better of her, and now she lamented the way she had treated her husband.
Well, she had a volatile temper, and I think she regretted the times that she blew up. But she missed him. She didn't realize while he was alive what a quiet guidance he gave.
Without that guidance, Maria could not keep up her tight hold on the family, and trouble began to brew. The children were now mostly in their 20s and 30s, and they wanted to strike out on their own. But Maria would have none of it.
Maria put a lot of pressure on the children to stay in the group and kept them so busy with their chores, which they had to do as members of the group, that they had little time for lives of their own, and they resented that.
Whether on their tour bus or working their mountain farm, Maria had kept the children isolated from the outside world. Rosemary, Maria's eldest child, suffered the most. Constant stage fright and a devastating sense of loneliness had taken its toll.
I had a hard time communicating at that time with my family, and the pressure became very great in my head. And one night I just ran out and thought maybe I'd find relief.
It had only been 4 months since her father's death when 18-year-old Rosemary dashed out of the house and disappeared into the Vermont woods. Her family looked everywhere, but the moonless night revealed nothing. 3 days later, she was spotted wandering across a farmer's field, cold, hungry, and disoriented. Maria was at a loss. She could see only 2 options for Rosemary. a convent, or a mental hospital. She opted for then experimental treatment, electroshock therapy. Maria thought she was doing what was best. Rosemary never returned to the singing group. She was the first to leave. The next to go was 29-year-old Johanna Von Trapp, who in 1948 decided to do something her three older sisters had never even dreamed of. She announced that she was going to get married. Maria was furious. In her eyes, leaving the choir meant compromising the entire family's ability to earn a living, and Maria had no intention of allowing that to happen. She locked Johanna in her bedroom and would not let her out.
It was not made easy for the first girl who got married because she was, at that time, the first soprano.
But Johanna would not submit to her mother any longer. She waited until just before dawn, climbed out her second-story window, and eloped with her boyfriend.
It was a shock. It was a shock. And so then we just regrouped, and I was sent to have voice lessons, and that was that.
Still, Johanna's bold action paved the way for other Von Trapp children to leave the choir. And soon, Maria was forced to hire professional singers to keep the group going. But it was clear that the Trapp family singers could not continue much longer. So indomitable Maria came up with another way for the family to make money. During the 1950s, Americans fell in love with a sport Europeans had been doing for centuries, skiing. The Von Trapp's home was located right in the heart of Vermont ski country, and Maria saw the potential of turning the family home into a ski lodge.
We sort of eased into it without really ever making a conscious decision to go into the hotel business. And then we saw what we were in the hotel business, and we might as well formalize it and call it the Trapp Family Lodge.
But the Trapp Family Lodge wasn't turning a profit. And in January 1956, after nearly 20 years together, the Trapp family singers finally disbanded. The family debt began to mount. So when a German production company offered to buy the rights to Maria's book, this time she couldn't say no. Without consulting her lawyer, Maria agreed to sell the rights to her book for a flat fee of $9,000. She would have no share in any of the profits to come.
My mother never was very good with business deals. She was too impatient for one thing. She didn't have time for negotiating and didn't like having an agent. It was a very poor deal.
Time would show just how bad a deal it really was. When the German film Die Trapp-Familie opened throughout Europe in 1956, it was an overnight box office sensation. It was so popular, in fact, that it was released in the United States. And before long, the movie caught the attention of a well-known theater actress, Mary Martin.
Mary Martin was clearly a Broadway star. I don't think they make them today like they did then. I mean, and she looked for vehicles.
And Mary Martin saw the Von Trapp story as her next vehicle. Soon, producers were working to develop a musical they planned to call The Singing Heart. They assembled a Broadway dream team, consisting of playwrights Howard Lindsay and Russell Krauss, composer Richard Rodgers, and lyricist Oscar Hammerstein. Broadway's brightest stars set to work on the show that Richard Rodgers would rename The Sound of Music. When the producers met with Maria to discuss their project, they were astonished to learn that she had given up all control over her own story when she sold the rights to the makers of Die Trapp-Familie. As a goodwill gesture, they offered her a small royalty, 0.3%, which Maria gratefully accepted. The Sound of Music opened on Broadway on November 16, 1959. Maria wore a dress that Mary Martin had sent her, leaving behind her trademark Austrian costume for just one night. But Maria wasn't the only Von Trapp to get a makeover. The play itself left behind the real Von Trapp story in favor of splashy Broadway drama.
You know, Rodgers and Hammerstein did not want to make a documentary film. They took some events from our life and made their own story, and I always have the feeling they took the raisins out of a dough and made a new dough around.
Even though the show took great liberties with the truth, Maria proudly considered The Sound of Music her story.
The Baroness Von Trapp came to the musical, and when Mary Martin came out to take her bow, Maria Von Trapp stood up also, which was a surprise, but a great plus for the audience.
Maria loved the attention, but still there was one aspect of the show that made her quite unhappy.
She did not like the way my father was portrayed, because he was a much kinder person. He was not the martinet that they made him out to be. And that's the part that none of us liked, because we knew him, and we knew him for who he was.
The Sound of Music would run on Broadway for 1,442 more performances, a huge success. But for the Von Trapps, it was just a beginning. Their fame would reach unbelievable proportions as soon as the Hollywood version of their story hit the silver screen.
Raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens, bright copper kettles and warm woolen mittens, brown paper packages tied up with strings. These are a few...
The Broadway success of The Sound of Music did not go unnoticed in Hollywood. In June of 1960, 20th Century Fox paid the unheard-of sum of $1.25 million for the rights to turn the stage play into a movie. When Maria learned that a film adaptation was in the works, she began lobbying the director, Robert Wise, to soften the portrayal of her husband. Wise refused. The play worked as it was, he said. But Maria would not be entirely shut out of the new production. In her typically bold style, Maria showed up in Salzburg while the film was being shot and demanded a part. This time, Wise gave in. The real Maria was allowed to serve as an extra in a scene with the Hollywood Maria, Julie Andrews. For 3 hours, Maria walked back and forth across an archway as the director shot take after take. Little did she know that she would be nearly unrecognizable when the movie hit the screen. The Sound of Music opened in theaters across the country in March of 1965. And it immediately became the most popular movie in America. Audiences everywhere were swept away by the sweet story of the Von Trapps.
Were you this much trouble at the Abbey?
Oh, much more, sir.
When Maria first saw The Sound of Music, she too found herself pulled into the drama, a little more than most.
I think the wedding scene just so enveloped her. She actually got out of her seat and walked down the aisle, thinking she was going to go forward to marry my father again. She did that. In movies or plays, she would become part of the story. And this story wasn't very hard for her to become part of, especially at that point.
Still, Maria could not forget her deal with the German production company. When she signed away the rights to her book, she unwittingly signed away the chance to be a multimillionaire. The Sound of Music was bringing in a flood of money, but not for the Von Trapps.
I don't know where the millions roll, but they don't roll into our pocket. But I tell you something, which is much more. The people love us. Our name is not forgotten because of The Sound of Music. I even get sometimes a first-class seat in the plane if one is available. And it's wonderful.
It may not have made the Von Trapps rich, but the success of The Sound of Music made Maria a celebrity. She went on variety shows, lecture tours, radio shows, and talk shows.
Übers Bachel bin ich sprungen, mit Wiesel bin ich lieb, und ein Sohn hat mich tricket, wann mich netzt hat dei Ring, und ein Sohn...
While her children now enjoyed staying put after years of traveling on, seemed to slow down.
She loved to travel. She loved to interact with audiences. She was similar to politicians who, shake hands with 2,000 people and seem to have drawn energy from it rather than lost it.
Death.
Maria Kuchera Von Trapp died March 28, 1987, at the age of 82. She was buried in the family plot next to her husband, a stone's throw from the Trapp family lodge. By sheer force of will, Maria had kept her family together and made them a success, even when all odds seemed stacked against them. And in the end, she helped make the Von Trapp family known all around the world.
The film and the play have been such a powerful force in so many people's lives. I mean, a lot of people have told me that when they're really unhappy, really desperate, they rent that video and sit down and watch it, and then they can go on with their lives. What do you say to someone after that?
The Sound of Music continues to win over the hearts of new generations. On March 12, 1998, the revival of the stage play opened on Broadway, and the Von Trapps were greeted as if they were the stars of the show. But the Broadway revival is not the only production keeping the Von Trapp name alive.
It is one of the top 2 shows done in high schools every year across America. Its success just keeps going. In fact, there are 500 to 600 different productions of The Sound of Music mounted anew every year around the world.
While the world may remember the Von Trapps for The Sound of Music, the Von Trapps take pride in their own accomplishments as the Trapp family singers.
Many people think we only yodeled. We sang classical music. So, we had good music and a big variety.
It was an experience to be able to sing in that group. Really. I have been asked to join other groups. I can't. It's just, it was unique what we had.
At the moment, the hills of Vermont are alive with the sound of bickering. 2 branches of the Von Trapp family are feuding over money. One group claims it is owed $3 million by the other. Their family squabble has made it all the way to the Vermont State Supreme Court. Meanwhile, the revival of The Sound of Music is playing to sellout crowds on Broadway. It opened exactly 60 years after German troops marched into Austria, the event that started the Von Trapps on their amazing adventure.